So, what is cinematic video, and why are filmmakers obsessive over achieving the cinematic look? Here is an exploration of cinematic images. For a film to achieve a cinematic look, the filmmaker will often deploy specific techniques, such as slow motion. This can be seen in Christopher Nolan's Inception, with its use of slow motion to emphasize its complex structure and how each layer of subconscious is subject to a different rate of time. Of course, this technique does not have to be driven narratively and can be used to draw out action or add even more impacts to a shot. Put simply, it can make an already cool shot even cooler and more effective on the viewer. So let's take a look at some other techniques. There are many great examples of the long take through cinema's history, but a more recent example that really shows its effectiveness is the take in the Battle of the Bastards in Game of Thrones. Clever cutting and timing make for a very complex and immersive experience, which is just what this technique is used to achieve. By suspending a shot and blending the editing, we as the viewer feel a part of the action on screen and thus more involved and invested. Camera movement, or in some cases lack of, can elevate a sequence or shot. Examples of this can be seen in High Noon, where the camera cranes up to reveal a larger picture, making the subject seem more insignificant or part of something a lot bigger than himself. Other uses of this technique, such as the track, have the similar effect of the long take in bringing us into the action as if we were part of the scene. For example, this sequence from A Place Beyond the Pines, we feel as if we are immersed in the environment and are part of it. Even simple movements such as the panning shot, used in excess in the Grand Budapest Hotel, add to the film's cinematic presence, almost like turning the pages of a book.
Excuse me.
Another important area is in the use of camera angles. For example, Dutch angles to invoke a sense of delusionment, or in this example of 12 Monkeys, insanity.
The army of the 12 monkeys, they're the ones that spread the virus.
Low-angled shots to give the character dominance in a scene by physically placing them over the audience. Or in the opposite, using a high angle to give the subject a lack of authority or insignificance.
Yes, Miss Trunchbull. Sir.
Stand up straight, some again, shoulders back.
So as we can see, there are many areas that contribute towards how cinematography and the cinematic work together, but we will be focusing on three key areas: camera movement, composition, and lighting. So let's start with camera movement. Camera movement, put simply, is used to make sequences more interesting. Instead of having multiple shots of a character moving through a scene, with the camera movement we can travel with them and become more than just a spectator. Having a shot that has a little action or intensity other than a moving subject would not work as well if it was shot handheld, whereas if it was shot smoothly, it fits the action in the scene and no longer takes the audience out of the image. For example, this shot, where what is happening front and behind the camera do not match, there is no motive there, and therefore the shot is not as effective as it could be. A great example of a handheld shot would be the long take from Children of Men. The movement matches the chaotic environment and makes for a more immersive experience as we follow the character through the war zone. When it comes to framing and composition, there are no defined rules, yet filmmakers still use certain techniques to bring their films to the next level. By using tools such as the rule of thirds, Fibonacci spiral, leading lines, and so on. The most commonly used is the rule of thirds. Here are a few shots that follow the rule, placing the subject on the intersections of the horizontal and vertical lines on either side of the centre gives the viewer something to look for. The theory behind why this choice of image composition works is it gives the audience something to look for around the screen. If every image was centralized, then their eyes would not be averting to different areas of the screen, and they would not be as invested in the images that they are viewing. These shots are examples of when any form of composition is missing. We are no longer invested in the image as it cuts off odd areas of the subject and is positioned awkwardly on the screen. Bad composition and sequence can ruin the film's aim of immersing the viewer. Lighting, like all other areas of cinematography, is purely expressive in its aim, and like the other areas has techniques filmmakers use to achieve the cinematic look. Probably the most common and widely used method is the three-point lighting system. This is comprised of a key light as the main source of exposure, a fill light to soften the shadows on the other side of the face, and a backlight which gives the subject separation from the background. But this does not mean that this is the only option. Like other techniques, motivation is what makes or breaks them. Three-point lighting acts as a guide to then further build on or take away from. It is not something that has to be followed. Issues begin to arise when light is not used to properly expose the subject. Anything that looks unmotivated or unnatural in the shot's context will break its cinematic effect, especially when this comes to under or overexposing the image, a common mistake in amateur filmmaking. Motivated light is where we observe how lights in a location affect the scene and then recreate it and exaggerate its effect. For example, in this case, in the dark room with the practical of the phone, only really creating soft changes in the colour or temperature, but when we switch out the practical for a key and pass gels over the top to mimic the scrolling, a more visually pleasing and interesting image is produced. When it comes to lighting, there is no right or wrong, but some techniques work better than others and so are used more commonly in big budget films, thus creating a more recognisable style that we find to be cinematic. These are just a few of the basic techniques we can follow in the process of creating a cinematic experience, which expands to all areas of the production like sound, production design, and so on. But by following these basic principles as a basis in cinematography, we can further build and experiment to achieve a more impactful image.